guys, so in this video I'm going to explain what sus chords are and how they're used in jazz. So at its most basic, a sus chord is a triad which gets rid of the third and instead plays either a second or a fourth. So for example, if we have G major, we've got the B there. G minor would have the B flat. A G sus2 would play the 2 instead of the 3, so we'd have the A in there. And a G sus4 would play the 4 instead of the 3, so we've got the C in there. And generally sus4 chords are much more common than sus2 chords, so if you see a chord symbol that just says G sus, it usually means sus4. Now the great thing about this chord is that because it avoids the third, it's neither in G major nor in G minor, or rather it's in both. Now the way I'm playing it now gives it a really churchy sound. It sounds like we're in Sunday Mass. But jazz, being jazz, usually creates slightly more complex chords. And so generally in jazz you see sus chords in place of a dominant, and it's usually a G9 sus chord. So you play G9, but instead of the third you play the fourth. And generally when you're voicing sus chords in jazz, you would drop the D so that you have a F major, you can move the C to the top, and F major over G. Now if you listen, that gives a much more sort of open and spacey sound because it's sort of harmonically ambiguous. It's neither major nor minor because you're missing the third completely. It's sort of, the sound or the chord floats around a bit more. It's not as harmonically precise and distinct. Another way you often see the chord written as a D minor 7 over G. So that includes the fifth. So again, that's the G9 sus4 here. Just move the C to the top. So a D minor 7 over G. Now the great thing about that is that the most common chord progression used in jazz is a 2-5-1. So in the key of C major it would be a D minor 7 to G7 to C major 7. So this sus chord sort of sits in between both and can in fact replace either of the chord. So instead of playing the D minor 7 to the G7 to the C major 7, the 2-5-1, you can use the G9 or the G7 sus chord in place of the 2. So or in place of the 5. Or even in between. So I say a G sus chord sits in between the 2 and the 5 because if we take the D minor 7, the 2, we've got the A and the C. If we move those two down, we have the G and the B, and that gives us the G7 chord. So a G sus chord is effectively an in-between step in that you move this note down, but you still keep the fourth there, the sus. So that's effectively a G7 sus chord, just without the 9 in the voicing. And then to get to the G7, you move the other note. So it's a 2, sus, dominant, tonic. So in that way, it kind of works as a transition or an in-between chord between the 2 and the 5. But because of that, it can act as a replacement for the 2 or the 5, or in fact for both the 2 and the 5. So instead of playing the 2 to the 5 to the 1, you can just play the G7 sus to the G7 sus to the 1. And so that kind of acts as a reharmonization of a 2-5 progression by inserting the sort of G7 sus over the top of the 2 chords. Now, a common misconception about sus chords is that the 4 replaces the 3. But really, when you're voicing chords, you can put the 3 in as well as the 4. So you could play something like So we've got the G, the 4, the 7, the 9, and the 3. And that's fine, that works well. It's still a G7 sus chord, you've just put in the 3 as well. And usually the 3 works if you play it above the 4. If you play the 3 below the 4, it tends to get a bit sort of dissonant and muddy. So, compared to... Now the other interesting thing about G9 sus chords is that if you take the G9 sus chord and you take the D and you move it down here, you've got a so what chord voicing. And then if you take this A and you move it down here, you have a quartal chord voicing. And essentially all that means is that you have a chord built up in fourths instead of thirds. So, and quartal harmony, which I'll do a separate video on in a bit more detail, but essentially because it's a bit more harmonically ambiguous, because it's not built up in thirds, it's built up in fourths, which our ear isn't really used to in Western music. It's a bit more sort of spacey, and it sounds like the chord's kind of floating there, and there's no really tension, or there's no need to resolve the chord. It doesn't sort of want to be resolved to the tonic like a dominant chord does. Like that dominant chord really, really wants to go to the tonic chord. A quartal chord, or a G sus chord in this case, is a bit more sort of, as I said, floaty and spacey, and doesn't really want to go anywhere. It sort of just sits there by itself. So anyway, hopefully you can hear that. And one more great thing about sus chords is that if you've seen my video on avoid notes, you'll know that over the G7, the note C is an avoid note. That is, it's a note that creates an awkward, dissonant interval with the third and the G, and so it sounds sort of harmonically weak. So when you're improvising, you generally want to avoid the avoid note. But on a G sus chord, the C sounds perfectly fine because you've got it in the chord. Right, so by turning the dominant 7, in this case G7, which is in the key of C, into a G7 sus chord, we get rid of the avoid note. That is, the C, which is usually an avoid note, is no longer an avoid note, so you can use whatever note you like in the C major scale, which again is the key that it's in, over a G7 sus chord. There's no avoid note that you need to avoid. Now in more modern jazz, you'll also sometimes see G7 sus flat 9 chords. And essentially all that is instead of having the natural 9 in the sus chord, you put in a flat 9. And so you can voice it, for example, like this. Now that's also known as a G Phrygian chord, which is actually the third mode of the E flat major, so it's technically in the key of E flat major. That's sort of a little bit of an aside. But you can still use the G7 sus flat 9 to resolve to the C, to the tonic here. You can also voice it with the 13, so A flat, C, E, G. And again, that's technically in the key of F melodic minor. It's the second mode of F melodic minor. But again, that's not important. All I really want you to take away from that is that sus chords can have natural 9s or flat 9s. They both act more or less the same way and resolve to the tonic. So this explanation has been more or less how jazz has traditionally treated sus chords. G sus chord is effectively a substitute for the G7, for the dominant chord, except with the C in the bass, so you don't have an avoid note, as I said before. And so as a substitute for the dominant chord, it's generally, traditionally, it resolved to the tonic. But in more modern jazz, sus chords have been used to sort of sit there and linger and not really resolve anywhere. And this was sort of started by Herbie Hancock's song Maiden Voyage, which went something like this. Right, so that's a G7 sus chord. And it just sort of lingers there. And in fact, the song then goes to like a F7 sus chord and back to a D7 sus chord. And it sort of just floats around and goes from various sus chords without ever resolving to a tonic. And as I said, that's sort of a more modern approach to using sus chords. And that works great as well. Again, harmonically, that's sort of a bit more ambiguous. It floats around. It sounds very sort of spacious and, well, floaty. But yeah, so that's another good way to use sus chords, never actually resolving them. But as I said, traditionally sus chords have been used as substitute for dominant chords, which then resolve to the tonic. Anyway, that's all I really wanted to cover in this video on sus chords. Hopefully that all made sense and was a little bit enlightening. Again, feel free to leave any comments or questions below. Thanks for watching, guys. See ya.